Hi everyone. Before today's interview, I just want to let you know about some upcoming live CE courses. First, we have an online-only salon series, a fresh look at the Red Book, Reading the Liber Novus with Jungian Psychoanalysts, with Daniel Ross, Boris Matthews, and guest Jungian analysts. Next, we have Following Jung's Red Book, an experiential image-making seminar with Mary Doherty, art therapist and Jungian psychoanalyst. Finally, we have a webinar series, The Mirage of Truth, Psychology of Illusion and Self-Deception in Radical Beliefs with Vlado Schultz, Jungian analyst. CEs are available for all of these courses, and if you need CEs in a pinch, you can also check our website for self-study CE courses that you can do in a couple hours. For all of those, just visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and welcome to Jung in the World. During the global pandemic, many therapists took to the online world to deliver therapy. It has raised questions about what teletherapy can and can't do for us. If you're someone who wonders this yourself, joining us today is Gus Cwik, who has been offering Jungian analysis and psychotherapy virtually for several years now, and has made himself a student of that process and what it brings to the analysis and what it offers and what pieces you might need to fit in. Gus Cwik is a clinical psychologist, hypnotherapist, and Jungian analyst in private practice in the Chicago area. He is member of the Society of Jungian Analysts and the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. He's also on the editorial board of the Journal of Analytic Psychology and the executive board for the Archive for Research in Archetypal Symbolism. He was co-director of training of the Analyst Training Program and the Clinical Training Program in Analytic Psychotherapy at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. He has published several articles and numerous reviews, and he joins us today to talk about the technologically mediated self and therapy online. Hello, Gus, and welcome to Jung in the World.
Hi, Patricia. Thank you for having me.
Well, the reason I wanted to talk with you today is because you wrote this influential article in the height of the pandemic about psychotherapy via technology. And I'll give you the title, and we will also link below the article. The Technologically Mediated Self, Reflections on the Container and the Field of Telecommunications. And in it, you argue that psychoanalysis delivered via technology needed to be understood differently, not as the weak sibling of in-person psychotherapy, but it's something else. What is it? Talk about what makes it different and maybe even better.
Yes, I've always been kind of interested in technology, one of the kind of nerdy side of myself, kind of the geek. People have said I'm not on the cutting edge, I'm on the bleeding edge. I mentioned in the paper in that. So I was actually kind of into this even before the commercial systems came out. They had private telecommunications programs in the early days, but you had to buy them. You had to get through the firewalls. The patient or the other person, you had to have the same software, so it was not easy to do. But I was kind of experimenting with that even at that point, because this idea of being able to communicate with people at a distance was really important. And then I was also a big arguing for it even before COVID was coming out, to integrate it into the training programs, that it was really the way people were operating and connecting. And a lot of the programs, particularly when they went to monthly models like Chicago did, people were coming more from a distance. And so the idea of being able to do supervision, analysis, and count towards their training requirements. So I was a big proponent of that. I was arguing in Chicago, the other group I'm a member of, the Interregional Society, to count these hours. A certain number of hours could be counted because it helped with people and travel. So I was a big proponent kind of that even before COVID hit. I was right in the middle with Interregional. There were like really resistance to incorporating it, and we were having debates, arguments around it. And so the point, everybody kept going, well, it's not in person, Well, of course it's not, in terms of that. But if you only think of it as kind of an ersatz in person, I think you miss something of it, that this is a medium, this technologically mediated aspect of the self, which a lot of people are actually conversing this way. This is the way that they talk to one another. And the younger generation, and they're used to it. I was even half joking at that point, saying we should require people to do telecommunications, because this is what people are used to, and people all laughed and everything. And then COVID hit, and everybody was doing it. And all the people that were objecting to it in this way, and it's usually, particularly from the Jungians, but most of all, it's the embodiment. You don't have the bodies in the room, and so much was lost. But then again, all those people who would never even try it and were arguing against it, now everybody was kind of doing it. I kind of resisted, going, nah. I told you so, that it was a coming thing, but I had no idea it was going to be coming in that type of... So, the idea is like, yes, it doesn't have that part, but what does it have? That it's a different way of communicating, particularly the big advantage of it is, operating at a distance, that you actually don't have to be in the room with somebody, and somebody can still have a connection with you. So if there were somebody who are reaching out to, particularly in supervision, this was like if you really wanted to go to an expert on something, or like Don Kalshed for trauma, right, and not able to kind of fly in, do a session and do everything. All of a sudden, this was accessible. So it had certain things about it. And from my early work, I had begun to realize it was really a different medium. Knowing the person, usually I never got started on telecommunications, but we were in person, and then we would do sessions periodically. I began to notice that there were sometimes was different things, that they began talking about something, usually much more difficult things in terms of like maybe aggression, fantasies, sexual fantasies, where they actually felt safer with the distance. And that was a big part. This is what I'm getting at with the technologically mediated self. Very few of the people, when we went to it, actually became more inhibited. That wasn't my experience in talking to colleagues, that anybody got more closed off because of it. It actually, you either got kind of the in-person self, or you actually get a superset of that in-person self, like able to do something that they weren't able to do in person. So that was a part. I think there is some advantage to it, the being at a distance. And, the exact thing that most people criticize about it, I think it's also crown and not just its curse.
That really stood out in your article because that was counterintuitive for me. I study the digital culture and find that it tends to be very performative.
Performative, yes, I noticed you used that word. Yeah.
Right. And so I thought, well, if someone is feeling a greater sense of openness, and that's what you have observed, then the technology is forming a different kind of container. And maybe this is a good place to explain what we mean and what Jung meant by the container. And then we can apply it to the virtual world, the digital world. Help us out with that.
Yes. I had a paper, it was called From Frame Through Holding to Container, where I was trying to take, these are the three major tropes that have entered our psychoanalytic jargon, and it's usually considered the frame. I almost think of the frame as much more like the hard wiring. So after this 100-some plus years of analysis, we have, the frame consists of being at the same time, being in the same office, charging the fees, that you're interacting, we don't touch one another, maybe free association. These all became parts of the frame and the standard way of doing psychoanalysis. Then Winnicott kind of came along and he really began talking about like holding environments. And it became clear that for certain kinds of people, that rigid frame actually didn't work. You had to begin to make some changes to it, like be open to taking phone calls or outside of the set sessions because the anxiety was so great. So that there was changes in the frame. And then Jung really talked about kind of the notion of a container being a much more symbolic. I've compared it to the way that he describes libido itself, is that it moves in a spectrum from the infrared, which is the instinct and body level, into the ultraviolet, which is much more the spiritual, archetypal, mental, that it's not material. And I thought of the sort of frame moving to container in that same dimension. Yes, this is the frame we've decided upon, but actually the symbolic thing and the way people are interacting creates its own container that actually might override the frame. Could you do analysis in a foxhole, right? We don't have that, the safe space and everything. And yes, you could have a very deep interaction and connection with somebody at the analytic level, kind of at that. So Jung's notion and this beautiful paper by the Vosbene Clausum, the well-sealed vessel by Newman, is he refers to it, it's not just the thing that holds the process, it's actually the process itself. So the way that we're interacting actually becomes a bit of the container for the work. And one of the things related to this with telecommunications, so it began to change this whole thing of the analyst being in charge of the frame. And the patient had to adapt to it. Like, oh yes, you have to come at this time, you're going to be charged, you're going to be doing this. All of a sudden with telecommunications, it began to be what we call co-created. Like, unless you were going to force that on somebody and say, you have to do it at the same place in your office at the same time. But that's not what was happening during COVID, right? Because some people couldn't do that and they were doing it from home and there was other people around. So you had people I've had a number of people doing it from their car because it was the only place they could. I think the one thing we have to stand by is confidentiality. Like if they're doing it in a coffee shop and they're talking, I don't feel comfortable with that around that. So I might draw a limit on that. But otherwise, or people have done it walking through the park and holding up their phone around it, which was like, those were not options in the old model. So I think the idea of changing it from a set frame to a co-created element, which I think of more symbolically as a container for the work in which we both kind of create the circumstances by which we're going to operate.
So this co-creative idea, as I listened to you talk, it struck me that I was really listening to understand you. And I was recruiting everything I had, all of my energies, to being present to what you're explaining to me. Because it's, like I said earlier, some of this is counterintuitive. Your observations are very cutting edge. And is that part of what makes the virtual container a vessel for more openness? You talk about this idea of people really being present and people, feeling like they are in the moment. In other words, we're recruiting a lot of energy to come into this and a lot of will to come into these sessions virtually. Is that part of the scene here?
Oh, yeah, I think that's what I was, the literature was just filled with the negatives about it. The big standard one was Gillian Isaac Russell. She had written a book, Screen Relations, and it was really pretty negative towards it, advising against it, and the argument, the resistances I was running into with analysts in terms of, this is the way it's always been done, around it. So I was really trying to highlight something to take the other stand. Of course it has its limitations, and the imaginal body, as we'll talk about, is not the same as the being in the room together. But it's not that it's totally devoid of contact or affecting the body in this way. And so that's what I was trying to argue. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And particularly as we're kind of coming out of COVID and the requirement sort of, for this, because now the world has changed, right? Now we're definitely in the very least a hybrid model, in terms of where that is. And I think the guidelines for analysis are going to change around that it's like, even if you're seeing somebody in person, all of a sudden, sometimes they're going to want to do telecommunications. And again, the conscious reason, I'm running behind or I'm late or it'll be easier. But now we'll have to include, are there other motivations to avoid something in person when you move to the telecommunications, which, and I think having both would be a better model than just one or the other.
Oh, so you are a proponent of hybrid. And I think you say that in your article, that there is virtue in quarterly or, some string of in-person meetings. Is that still your stance?
It's, if, one can do that, I think it's much better. The idea was, like the transference and the feelings, the relationship were going to be diluted in telecommunications. Actually, what I've seen and what Rossler in one of his articles talked about is an intensification loop. So when you're working this way, and I don't think all of the things and transference is neglected or the body, but when you do get the bodies in the room, this three-dimensional aspect and the reality of the person, all the work that you've done, I think you get the transference, like exponentially, that it was like laying in wait, sort of, for the bodies to be in the room. So all that work then kind of, comes in, and because now all those action potentials are there. Yes, you can, all the things you were talking about, yes, they can be enacted in the space. So I think it functions that way too. So sometimes it's not possible. You might be working with somebody like from a different country around that to do a more hybrid thing. But I think it would be the preferred model.
You also surprised me in your article about the mind-body connection as it appears in the virtual space. That it's not something I expected. I mean, we're all talking heads on Zoom, right? So I would really like to just lean into this a little bit, this mind-body connection in the virtual container.
Yes, but it's really the important part. I became really aware of it in the early years before the Skype and FaceTime things, when we were using these early versions, and I leaned forward to get a notepad and the person backed away. All right. And the screen, I was like, oh, okay, something different's happening here, right? Because I had moved up this way, and that personal space was still kind of, clearly defined, right? So I was thinking away from a Jungian perspective, how do we get this? We know that the body can be affected right through the imagination, right? You watch a horror movie, it's over there and it's not real, and Freddy Krueger is not in the room with you, right? But you have all of the horror and the body and the anxiety and the reactions, right, come up in the body. So Jung's talking about this was the notion of what he called subtle body, right? And my kind of operational definition of that is like a body, the self in imagination that totally responds like you would in the real world. Like, people doing the active imagination, if people are familiar with that, like you're entering into imaginal space and, oh, this person is coming, and you flip them over and do that. Jung saying, no, that's not active imagination. That's fantasy. It's like, to feel like yourself and how you might react and have the adrenaline and the anxiety. This becomes closer to what he's talking about, subtle body, but in the imagination. And this subtle body, if you think of psyche and matter and psyche and spirit, is right at the interface of matter into what he called the psychoid realm, where you can't tell if it's psyche or if it's matter, right? So this subtle body is right at this interface between where it goes into matter. And because of that, it's deeply unconscious, right? We can't really kind of get into it. But the idea that, that we could talk about something at a distance and that the body could be involved without the body being in the room, there is kind of no doubt to me around that. Example, somebody just returned to analysis after being years apart, was dealing with the suicide of his son. And I sort of did a synopsis of our early work, right? Well, we know from our early work. And then he said, okay, yep, I know we're in it, because he began sweating. I could see the blood rushing to his face, and that we were touching in these areas, right? There was an example, kind of, I think of the subtle body and the work. It's like the imagination talking about something can definitely bring the body into play. And I think with telecommunications, you have to actually be more aware of that, like having where you feel that in your body, or is that kind of going on because we only really have the facial part? We don't have the lower body where we could see maybe the psychoactive leg, right? That's a usual telltale one where the leg starts bouncing and you could bring attention to that. It's like, okay, what's that about, around that. So you have to actually be more aware on telecommunications to bring it in. And so much of it is centered on the face. We might put a camera below the surface, but I'm not sure people are always wearing pants or, when they're in this session.
It could get a little salacious.
It could get a little.
But wait a minute. Now, this is a point of interest here, is when we're dealing with Zoom, let's say, there's my face and there's your face. If I go into analysis and I enter the consultation room, I see you, but I don't see myself. Is there something in that too that makes for an important difference in if what I'm undertaking is a deep examination of trauma or, some disorder, some anxiety? Is there some kind of healing that gets delivered or more candor gets delivered because I can see myself and you?
Yeah, that's, again, a difference, right? I've noticed some people will block that out, that they don't want to do it. I have one, patient that it comes in, you can always, it's like the mirror, right? All of a sudden she sees herself and she's moving her hair kind of, around that. So it is an additional part, like you get actually, you may, when something is going on, your attention might shift over. It's usually in a smaller, very few people put it on like a gallery view where the two of you are side by side. It's usually in that smaller, always the option for that. But I think that's additional information that you get an awareness of actually how you might be coming across, maybe flat, maybe something you notice in your face that you wouldn't have been able to see because you don't have that information. So I think it's actually another positive kind of, information that this allows that's not in the in-person setting.
You write at one point that the desire to connect is so strong. This is a quote. Quote, the desire to connect is so strong that we can overcome the limitations of cyber sessions. And I could be reading too much into this, Gus, but it made me wonder, does the psyche strive for its healing? Does it have its own willing suspension of disbelief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting notion. What I was trying to get at there is like that, the idea too of neuroplasticity. One of the arguments was like Zoom, you don't have the eye contact, right? Because you're looking at the screen and the camera is above it. So the eye contact is always a little off. And some people said, for that reason, I would never do it because that is so important. But the idea and that the urge for connection, and this is much more an object relations standpoint, interpersonal relationships, there's a longing for connection. So give the psyche an opportunity, right, which telecommunications might be, and it will find its own workarounds to actually make what it needs to happen to make you become the analyst and use the medium in the way. I've begun to think, people talk about like psyche and technology as opposites. So psyche is animated and alive. Soul and technology is dead and soulless and mechanical. Well, I hate to break it to them, but technology came out of psyche, right? I tend to think of, and particularly telecommunications, as psyche's attempt to extend itself at a distance. That one of its purposes is to utilize technology and the brain and science to be able to extend itself more into the universe rather than, it's like some bastard byproduct kind of, and science carries the shadow and the evil running into that with like AI now too.
Gus, that is a really forward-looking theory. Can I call that a theory, that psyche is extending itself? That kind of brings me to this other surprising point that you make, is that actually the technology facilitates imaginal play space. And I really had to sit down and think about that. How so?
It's, that was an interesting part, because this, like Isaac Russell in her book On Screen Relations, she said, this staring at the screen kind of subverts reverie and getting into the space. And I may talk about kind of, the role of reverie. And I was thinking, it was like, well, that's because you've got this negative attitude towards the technology, right? I'm saying if the imagination can be open, and it needs to be with the telecommunications, if you're in it and these people are just like, oh, shit, we're relegated to doing this type of thing, and the better thing would to be in this space, you're not going to open up this imaginative place. So this theorist Ogden uses this word like dreaming, that we're trying to get into, meaning able to do psychological work. That's what we're trying to open up, in analysis. I teach my supervisees of like, they're paying attention to the person and hearing them, but they're also paying attention to what's going on in their body and what particularly is coming up in their mind. And that use of the imagination, I think actually could be facilitated by this more, because it has a dreamlike quality. You're not there. It's not the person. It's like this phantom through these electrons around that. I think of that early time, I was into the computers, and before we had the MPG files and, the movie files. And I was at the first consumer conference when we had the static picture where we all were used to seeing, and then all of a sudden it began to move, right? It was like, a movie, and it was like, I dare to say, numinous. It was like, for all the geeks in the audience, like, oh my God, that's, amazing. And telecommunication is like taking that a step further in terms of that. But that dreamlike quality, I think, can be enhanced. And so there are a couple things in terms of like trying to make people more aware of that and what it is. I sometimes encourage people to use headphones, like in a teaching situation, so that it feels like it's coming inside, like you're hearing the voices as the inner experience, kind of rather out there. And that increases more of the proximity and nearness around it. There's another part in there that I brought in terms of like quantum fields, to maybe another way to open up the imagination to this type of, viewing what it is that you're doing, because you have to bring the imagination much more into this type of process.
Yes, I think when you talk about the quantum nature of analysis done virtually, I even have a quote from your article. You say, quote, deep interconnectedness and mutual interdependence in quantum systems is what you see applicable here? And, quantum is one of those words that has gotten overpopularized, misused, misapplied. So let's just right now, when you say quantum, Gus, what do you mean by it?
Well, first of all, I was trying to play on that popular notion of quantum, in terms of bringing it in of like, oh, we're using technology and what we're seeing are electrons and not really the person right around it. But the idea in the quantum, particularly the idea of non-locality, right, of what's opening up, and I think why even Jungian psychology is becoming more popular, because it's fitting. I think Jung anticipated, he was before his time with the ideas of synchronicity, of acausal relation, something not happening causally. And so by quantum, I was really trying to emphasize that things can kind of happen, that we have this spooky action at a distance, right? That these two particles that are in different places actually begin to change, but you can't even posit a cause of how they're connected. So the quantum has this acausal. I was really trying to tap into the imagination. For some people, that scientific thing, to think of it as like a quantum interchange, actually opens their imagination more, that you could affect things at a distance. This paper that I reference to is such a beautiful paper by Mansfield and Spiegelman, where they're talking about the physics of the transference situation. And so it was kind of almost tongue-in-cheek of kind of, bringing that in. Like, yeah, if you think about it this way, if you think about the imagination, you may open up the field to make this more of a container. If you start, the other argument that I had was like the instability of it, which usually drives people crazy, right? Like, oh shit, if that didn't happen, we'd have a real analysis here. But because it's unstable, it's much more reactive to actually emotional fields. I have not met any analyst that I've talked to about this that hasn't had the experience that you're at a key moment, the emotion is great, or an insight is happening and the damn thing breaks down, right? The picture shuts off, the sound goes away, the disconnection, signal lost doesn't occur. And it's like, okay, that's more than probability, right? Because of the unstable nature, we brought in another, like a Ouija board. It's like, it's something that's reactive that we can say, oh, let's go back to that. Maybe there's something really not wanting us to make that more conscious. Let's fight our way back kind of through that. And then you make the field much more of a container, as opposed to, again, this thing has interrupted the work we really need to do.
It's so interesting because I too was taken by that whole idea that the virtual realm, the digital delivery system, is unpredictable, but that's its own synchronicity.
Synchronicity opens it up.
Yes. And just a few days ago, I was interviewing someone who had a weak internet connection. And again, I was like, oh, gosh, in my mind, I was thinking, this is terrible. He keeps dropping out. And when I listened to it again, I realized that he had made his point. And the 3 sentences I lost after that were really just embellishment. They weren't. And so as I listened to it, he sounded really, terse and in a good way. He was very clipped and made sharp points. And I thought, this worked out great.
Yes. Yeah, but that's what I mean. As opposed to seeing it immediately as a problem, can it be enfolded into the experience. And the same thing with the happenings, which again, when you're in your office, your spouse or your child is not going to wander in, or your dog or something like that, but noticing, the spouse wandered in, right as we were talking about this key thing in your relationship, right? Like almost like those sort of, drawn. These things can underline the work and help deepen it, as opposed to just seeing them as interferences, if you can hold them correctly. And not to say there aren't true glitches and screw ups and the internet is down kind of, one day you want to read field kind of, interpretations into that. But some of them are, and if you unfold them into the field, I think they actually have the potential for deepening the work, not disrupting it.
And I think this is really the spirit of your article, is that we all live in this world now, this hybrid world, analysts and analysts alike, and technology is an opportunity, and don't make it a problem.
Yeah, try to see that it's there for a purpose, like that notion of psyche, sort of trying to extend itself, as opposed to, that was part of the problem, that I was running into. One of the arguments, in the Red Book, Jung talks about the spirit of the times versus the spirit of the depths, right? And my opponents were arguing, it's the spirit of the depths and the way that it was done, kind of, before, and the richness of that, and the spirit of the times. And this is so, and people are on their devices, and, there's no depth. And it's like that. But I don't think that that's the right that we should look at it. We should look at how the spirit of the times can tap into the spirit of the depths. Just because it's old doesn't mean that it's actually much more meaningful. Some of the people that I talk to, you'd say to them, how's that quill working out for you?
Right. How's that buggy whip?
It's like, we've moved on, right?
Right.
It's like typewriters, computers, right? You're not staying with those things. Like, they're not just bad things. They are part of the individuation, if you will, of the collective. Right?
Well, I also think that what you're saying here today, Gus, is tremendously exciting, in that if I did just a cursory scan of some of the great writers and thinkers who came after Jung, who studied with Jung, some of them touched the collective profoundly, because they were able to take Jung's experiments and Jung's, very forward-looking, in many cases avant-garde thinking, that then became a little more archival, if you will, or became doctrine. And they were able to thrust it into the future in a way that helped the collective see the energy in these ideas and see its relevance to them in the present, and have a different vision for their healing, for the future. And I think that's what you're advocating here.
Yeah, well, that it can be there, that it not be automatic. Yes, it's got its problems and their shadow involvement, but there's this immediate reaction to focus on that instead of like holding it. It may have a purpose, right? And what is that? How is it trying to further psyche? I mean, I find it hard to believe, look at Jung when he did all the alchemy work on all the note cards and the concordances, and he's writing down, right? The snake here appears in this and this and this, and then he's drawing references. Don't tell me that he wouldn't use a database and punch that in, or use AI, and the AI could find the common thing, extract the essence of all of those things. I can't believe that he wouldn't do that, around that, rather than by this, hand in the old way.
Right. He would have been a man of his times.
I would really think so. That's what I mean. I don't think he diminished that part. He had the two sides, right? The two personalities. But as I say, we shouldn't keep them disparate. It's like the depths. How do we find the depths in the spirit of the times?
And that's a beautiful thought for us to end on. How do we find the depths in the spirit of the times? And thanks for leading us there today, Gus Cwik.
Oh, thanks. You could tell it. I love it.
Yes, and I thoroughly enjoyed having you on the podcast today.
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me, Patricia.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks to our 2022 donors who gave at the contributor level or above: Barbara Anand, Juni Alkut, Usha and Ashok Bedi, Building Leaders Inc., Judith Cooper, David J. Dalrymple, George J. Didier, Mary Doherty, Ryan Mayer, Forrest Matthews, Judith A. Robert, Diane Sherwood, Lawrence C. Tingley, Deborah Tobin, Don L. Troyer, Robert Ulrich, Gerald A. Weiner, Ellen Young, and Wei Zhang. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.